Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we're just going to talk about, we're going to do some exercises on formalizing arguments. Okay? So, in our first example, we have a passage here by Rene Descartes, and it goes, "To begin the answer, I will note that mind differs importantly from body, and that body is by its nature divisible, while mind is indivisible. When I think about my mind, or in other words, about myself, insofar as I am just a thinking thing, I can't distinguish any parts. I understand myself to be a single unified thing. Although my whole mind seems united to my whole body, I know that cutting off a foot, arm, or other limb would not take anything away from my mind. And the abilities to will, sense, and understand can't be called parts, since it is one and the same mind that wills, senses, and understands. On the other hand, whenever I think of a physical or extended thing, I can mentally divide it, and I therefore understand that the object is divisible. This single fact would be enough to teach me that my mind and my body are distinct." So again, when we formalize arguments, we're using this kind of four-step process. The first step is then to ask about any terms that appear confusing to you. Okay? Now, if you look in the passage, there should be a number of these. So in the first sentence, for example, Descartes says, "I will note that my mind differs importantly from body, and that body is by its nature divisible," right? Divisible here means can be divided, right? So for example, you could take, some physical object and break it into two pieces, right? And then he says, while my mind is indivisible, right? So while divisible means sort of can be broken into parts, indivisible means that it cannot be. So Descartes' claim here is that somehow the mind cannot be broken into parts, right? Okay. The next couple terms, I think, he uses the term physical and extended, right? Physical things just mean sort of like objects that exist in space and time, right? And then extended means sort of like having dimensions, right? Length and width and so on. And then the last term that we might worry about here is the idea of two things being distinct from one another, right? At the very end of the passage, Descartes says, "This single fact will be enough to teach me that my mind and my body are distinct." So, I think distinct here, the idea is that his mind and his body are distinct in the sense that they can be separated, they can be pulled apart. That's what Descartes is actually arguing. So Descartes actually thinks that you could, in some sense, take and pull apart and separate the mind from the body, right? Okay. The last thing that we'll discuss, the last term that you might be worried about here, is actually what the mind is, right? One of the things as philosophers we can't do is we can't just walk into a passage like this and take, that kind of term lightly. So I think to be clear straight away that by mind, Descartes just doesn't mean something like the brain. In fact, Descartes means actually much more than that. To Descartes, the mind is thought itself, consciousness, right? Sensation and so on, right? And actually what Descartes thinks is that kind of stuff is generated in virtue of a kind of non-physical, almost spirit that belongs inside of us, right? And that's what he's going to try to argue. But nevertheless, I think what Descartes is concerned about most when he talks about the mind is whatever the thing is that's doing the thinking and having the conscious states and the sensations that we do and so on, right? Okay. So the next step then, of course, is to find the issue in the passage. And I think in this passage here, the easiest way to find the issue is by finding the conclusion, because the conclusion answers the issue. And if you look at the end of the passage, it's really clear and it's pretty easy and straightforward to see what the conclusion of this argument is, right? What Descartes is trying to support is quite simple, right? He says, this single fact, right, which is kind of your indicator phrase there, this single fact would be enough to teach me that my mind and my body are distinct, right? So he's saying there that my mind and my body are distinct. So that is actually the conclusion of Descartes' argument. Again, Descartes actually wants to argue that the mind and the body can be separated somehow. Okay? So the issue then of the argument is that question, right? Rephrasing that conclusion as a question. So it's something like, are the mind and body distinct? And then the conclusion is just the answer to it, yes, right? Okay? Now, what we need to do next is then search for the premises of Descartes' argument. Somehow, Descartes is trying to argue here to show that the mind and the body are distinct, can be separated, right? Now, I think, again, if we look straight away to the very beginning of this passage, we can see quite clearly that he needs two premises straight away. He says, to begin the answer, I will note that mind differs importantly from body, and that body is by its nature divisible, while mind is indivisible. So clear right there, it seems that he's arguing that while the body is divisible, the mind is not, right? So we're going to have as our first two premises those, right? The mind is indivisible, and the body is divisible. And then we're going to have as our conclusion, then we're going to add in the mind and body are distinct. So far what we've got is three steps. We've got the body is divisible, the mind is indivisible, therefore the mind and body are distinct. Now, these two premises in this conclusion, I think, to be honest, my take on this argument is that's kind of what Descartes intends to say, right? And I think the best way to look at it is that the rest of the passage, if you look at really what he's trying to do, is he's really with the rest of the passage trying to support either one or two. He's trying to support either the divisibility of the body or the indivisibility of the mind, right? So, for example, he says, when I think about my mind, right, this is our second sentence, when I think about my mind, or in other words, about myself, insofar as I am just a thinking thing, I can't distinguish any parts. I understand myself to be a single unified thing. So there what he seems to be trying to support and explain and expound on is the indivisibility of the mind. So he's essentially providing evidence, reason for the indivisibility of the mind, right? Now, at the end of the passage, he also then goes on, right, to do the same thing for premise one, the divisibility of the body. He says, on the other hand, whenever I think of a physical or extended thing, I can mentally divide it, and I therefore understand that the object is divisible. So here he's trying to support the divisibility of the body, right, which is premise one. So, and really that's how it goes for the rest of the passage as well. He's got really just these two premises. The body is divisible, the mind is indivisible, and the mind and body are distinct. So that is his argument. So now we've got the argument. So what about evaluating the argument, right? Now, I think clearly this is a good example of an argument where you can kind of just pick on one premise, try to find fault in just one of them, right? And here what we're going to try to do is just cast doubt on premise two, the indivisibility of the mind, okay? And I think the clearest way to show that the mind, or at least to cast doubt on that premise, the indivisibility of the mind, is to just think about ways where, situations where, moments where we might consider the mind to be divided, right? And to me, the best examples seem to be sort of like psychological disorders, you know? For example, you might say that depression, right? Or something even like schizophrenia is a kind of broken mind, a fractured mind, right? An even better example is that there's a disorder called dissociative identity disorder, which is sometimes also called multiple personality disorder. And this is a kind of disorder where you have a person that has kind of essentially many minds in one, many personalities in one. And so that seems like clearly a divided mind. But I think if you even just think about things like, someone has a stroke and they lose the ability to speak, right? That kind of feels like, in a certain sense, that part of the mind is broken off or something like that. So again, these are all ways we might consider two to be false. And again, that's all we really have to do is just cast some doubt on two to press Descartes here, and to switch and move the burden of proof back onto him, so he has to defend the argument, right? So I think we've probably done that here, okay? Okay, so then moving forward, Our next example, right, is actually from Rene Descartes as well. And he says, but when I pay more careful attention, it's clear that I can no more separate God's existence from his essence than I can separate the essence of the triangle from its angles equaling two right angles, or the idea of a mountain from the idea of a valley. It is no less a contradiction to think that God, the supremely perfect being, lacks existence, a perfection, than to think that a mountain lacks a valley. All right. Now, the nice thing about this one, the reason I like this argument so much and this passage so much, is because Descartes is using a lot of metaphor here. He's talking about triangles, and he's talking about mountains and valleys, and is all to make a point about God, right? Okay, so the first, again, the first question when we tackle these formalizations is always to ask about the terms, the terminology, the vocabulary that seems to be tricky here, right? And I think the one that strikes, most as tricky about this one is the idea of an essence, right? Descartes here, uses the term essence, and he uses it sort of straight away. He says, but when I pay more careful attention, it's clear that I can no more separate God's existence from his essence than I can separate the essence of the triangle from its angles equaling two right angles, right? So I think essence right here is kind of like maybe what you would think of essence being is kind of like what's essential about something, right? What makes it what it is. That's what an essence is. So the second step in our process here is to find the issue of Descartes' passage, right? And I think, again, one of the things you want to try to do when you read these passages a couple times usually. And I think there's a couple, things that will help. One being that usually certain sentences stand out as kind of key sentences. A lot of times it's the first sentence, a lot of times it's the last sentence. But usually you've got kind of like indications of importance in the sentence, And the sentence will kind of sound like it's making some kind of key claim, right? So if you look at the way this passage starts off, it says, but when I pay more careful attention, it's clear that I can no more separate God's existence from his essence, again, than I can separate the essence of the triangle from its angles equaling two right angles. So again, what Descartes is worried about here is God and God's existence, right? He says God's existence there in that claim, right? So the issue here, I think we've seen this before in Mackey's argument from evil. The issue here is then, does God exist, right? Now, unlike Mackey and the argument from evil, of course, what Descartes is going to argue here is that God, in fact, does exist, which is the conclusion of the argument, right? And you can kind of see that in the last sentence. He says, it's no less a contradiction to think that God, the supremely perfect being, lacks existence than to think that a mountain lacks a valley. So essentially what Descartes is saying there is that it's kind of like a contradiction to think that God doesn't exist. So God has to exist, right? Okay, so then kind of moving forward then, we know that Descartes' conclusion is that God is real, God exists, right? So then our last step, of course, in the formalization process is to think about and to look for his premises, right? Now, for me, the easiest way to spot this one and to see what's going on in this one is to understand that the terminology and the phrases he uses about triangles and angles and mountains and valleys is all kind of like a metaphor of explanation, a tool, right, that Descartes is using to try to persuade you, right? And I think more than anything, that is almost just like extra added stuff that we don't really need to put into our argument. And so now if we focus just on his very last sentence, we really have the crux of the argument. So Descartes says that it is no less a contradiction to think that God, the supremely perfect being, lacks existence, a perfection, than to think that a mountain lacks a valley. And you can see there that Descartes is making a claim, one, that God is the supremely perfect being. And then he says, secondly, existence is a perfection. Right? So we're going to have those as the premises of our argument. And so what we have then is 1, God is a supremely perfect being. 2, existence is a perfection. Therefore, 3, God exists. And really, that's all we need to get to that conclusion, right? And so that really seems to be Descartes' argument. Now, I think at this point, then, we should really kind of worry about evaluating that argument, and how you might evaluate it. This is another argument, I think, usually arguments that tread on God's existence either for or against. I think there's a number of ways you can reply to these types of things. So we can do the same thing here. I'll just talk about the two premises each, how you might reply to them. So first, it's God is the supremely perfect being. We might just simply cast some doubt on that by trying to argue that God doesn't necessarily have to be that. Maybe God isn't supremely perfect, right? If you look at some of the religions throughout history, God isn't defined like that at all, right? That's the first point. The other point that I usually make in my classes about this is that it's really interesting idea, God being supremely perfect, because if you read the Bible, right, there are times when God doesn't really look that perfect, right? For example, if you think about the story of the flood and Noah, or Sodom and Gomorrah, right? These are times when God actually appears to be kind of like vengeful, almost. And I think there's a lot of times where God is really trying to teach someone a lesson, some kind of lesson. And so one of the ways that I always like to put this is that maybe God doesn't have to be perfect in every way, but instead he's somehow perfectly just, right? Imagine that if we had a God that was a just God, a perfectly just God. That kind of God wouldn't necessarily have to be, perfectly good or these other types of things, that we often hear, right? And if God was just perfectly just, it would explain a lot about how God acts in the Bible. And yet it might not be the kind of God that would necessarily have to exist, right? Which is what Descartes is trying to tell us here, right? Does a perfectly just God have to exist in virtue of being just? Probably not, right? So that might be one of the ways we could respond here, is trying to deny premise 1. And again, all we're trying to do is just cast a bit of doubt on that, so that the burden of proof shifts back on Descartes, so Descartes has to defend. All right? Now, secondly, we might challenge his second premise here, that existence is a perfection. And again, I think what Descartes is trying to argue here is that it would be more perfect if God was real than if God was, say, an imaginary being that we all just kind of, it was in our minds, and we talked about God and all of this, but God wasn't real, right? So it would be better if God, in fact, was real than if God was just imaginary. That's kind of the point here. And I think that's probably right. That's probably a correct assumption. But for the sake of argument, let's just think about why you might not think that, right? Why you might disagree. So I think, for example, one of the things that has always struck me about this one is that you could imagine a lot of people, right, having these kind of conceptions of God as being this or that way, right? Now, if you imagine God as being kind of a real being, it seems to me what would end up happening is that a lot of people would be kind of let down in a certain sense, if we actually had a look at God, right? If we actually saw God in reality, he might not be quite what we expected, right? Now, on the other hand, if God was just an imaginary being in our minds, God could be whatever we thought, right? And so there wouldn't be that, sort of like letdown ever, right? Which is maybe a way in which it's not quite as good if God is real. I'm not sure how good that kind of counter argument is, that reply, but it's worth a thought, right? And that's all we're kind of trying to do here, is just throw out some possible objections. So, all right. The other ways in which you might think about how to reply to this one is you might argue that it kind of looks like here, and this is a classic way to reply to this argument. It kind of looks like here that what's going on is Descartes is almost defining God to be, right? Descartes says God is supremely perfect and existence is a perfection, so God exists, right? But you might argue that essentially what Descartes has done here is he's defined God as supremely perfect and he's defined existence as being perfect. And so from those two definitions, it follows that God must be real. But the point is really simple, is that by way of defining something as perfect or as existence being perfect, it doesn't make God pop into existence, right? The way that something is defined has no impact on whether it's real or not, right? Definitions are just words, right? And whether or not something like God exists is a fact of the matter that isn't impacted by the way that we define it, you know? And so the point here might be just quite simply to argue that the moves that this argument is making don't really work, you know? And so there's something wrong with the reasoning involved in the argument. And so it's kind of like a mistaken argument or something, right? That's another kind of classic way to reply to this argument. And so that might be another way to go. But okay, well that's it for the second example. So we'll move to the third example now. So example 3 here says the fourth way derives from the gradations to be found in things. Some things are found to be better, truer, or more noble than others, but something is said to have more or less of a quality according to its distance from a maximum. Thus, the hotter a thing is, the closer it is to that which is maximally hot. There is therefore something that is maximally true, good, and noble, and this thing must be the greatest being, for those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being. But the greatest thing of a kind is the cause of everything of that kind. As fire, the hottest thing is the cause of everything hot. There therefore is something which is the cause of being, of goodness, and of whatever other perfections there may be in things, and this we call God. So you should be able to see straight away again that we have a passage here about God and God's existence. Okay? Especially in particular at the very end of the passage, you kind of see that made clearly. But let's start and begin with question point 1, which is terminology. Do we see any kind of terminology here that's tricky? And I think really there are, maybe a few small ones here, but nothing really too tricky. I think he says in the very beginning here, he says the fourth way derived from the gradations to be found in things. So gradations here means something like degrees, right? He then says, there is therefore something that is maximally true, good, and noble, right? So again, he's talking about God there and being sort of maximally true, good, and noble, right? So you can imagine God being maximally good and then somehow being maximally true, like being the most true being there is, something like this, okay? Now, with regard to the second point, which is the issue, again, I think with this example, we can again find the issue by trying to find the conclusion of the argument. And if we look at the very end of the argument, we can see that pretty clear, right? He says, there therefore is something which is the cause of being, of goodness, and of whatever other perfections there may be in things, and this we call God, right? And that point there, he says, and this we call God, seems to be his conclusion. So the issue then that we see here is does God exist? And he answers that his conclusion is that yes, God is real. Now, the next step, of course, the fourth step in our process here is to look for the premises. And with this one, I think it's a bit trickier, right? But, I think really this is one where most of what he says becomes a premise of his argument. So if you start at the very beginning of the passage, right, he says, the fourth way derives from the gradations to be found in things. Really right there, I think he's just kind of introducing the argument, so we don't really have a premise. But then he says, some things are found to be better, truer, or more noble than others. And I think that will probably put in as a premise. It seems to be something important. Then he says, but something is said to have more or less of a quality according to its distance from a maximum. There is therefore something that is maximally true, good, and noble. Right? Both of those claims we're going to add in as premises as well. So that's going to give us 3 premises, right? One is that some things are better, truer, or more noble than others. And 2, something has more or less of a quality according to its distance from a maximum. And then following from those two claims is the claim that there is something that is maximally true, good, and noble. Now, if you look forward in the passage, you can see quickly where he's going to add in some premises, right? He says, the next kind of point he makes is, he says, and this thing must be the greatest being, for those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being, right? So we might add that claim in as well. Now, if you look back at the passage again, he says, but the greatest thing of a kind is the cause of everything of that kind. That's kind of a key point, right? And so that's going to be our fifth premise. And then our sixth premise will be in the next sentence. He says there, therefore is something which is the cause of being, of goodness, and of whatever other perfections there may be in things. And so that would be our sixth premise then. So we have then, in this argument, six premises, right? Some things are found to be better, truer, or more noble than others. Something is said to have more or less of a quality according to its distance from a maximum. There is therefore something that is maximally true, good, and noble. Those things are greatest in truth, or greatest in being, and the greatest thing of a kind is the cause of everything of that kind, and the therefore is something which is the cause of being, of goodness, and of whatever other perfections there may be in things. And of course he thinks that being is God, and so that leads us to his conclusion that God exists. And so we have here then our final formalization, which is six premises leading to the conclusion that God exists. Okay? Now, at this point in the process, right, this is where we're going to evaluate the argument. And this is a really nice example for evaluation, because I think there's one particular point, one particular premise here that is really seems to be false, really seems to be a weakness. And that is premise 5, right? Premise 5 says, the greatest thing of a kind is the cause of everything of that kind. The author of this argument, who's actually St. Thomas Aquinas, okay, and he was this sort of theologian, right, and he's living during the Middle Ages, and Aquinas is a huge fan, right, he loves Aristotle. In fact, during the Middle Ages, during the time of Aquinas, most people thought that Aristotle was kind of like the inventor, the philosopher, right? The inventor of philosophy, and essentially his word was taken as truth, right? And right, if you understand that, right, you'll understand that this premise here, the greatest thing of a kind is the cause of everything of that kind, is an Aristotelian premise. It's from Aristotle's words, right? And what Aristotle thought was that what the Greeks thought, right? Aristotle was a famous Greek philosopher. What the Greeks thought and what the science was during that time was that the world was composed of these elements, right? And the elements included fire and water and air and earth, right? There was these four elements. And when you think about that idea, you can see kind of why Aristotle would make the claim that the greatest thing of a kind is the cause of everything of the kind, right? Which is, essentially, whatever anything was hot, right? What the Greeks thought, the science then, was that, well, that's caused by the fire element, right? And so that was the cause of all hot things, But of course now we know that all of that science is wrong, right? And so I think here's a good example where we can kind of just think of trying to find an example where something that's the greatest isn't the cause of all things like that, right? So take, for example, the idea of something being heavy, right? Heaviness, right? If 5 was true about heaviness, that would mean that the most heavy thing in the universe causes all things to be heavy, right? This is not true though, right? What makes something heavy? What makes something heavy is mass and gravity, things like that, right? And so heaviness isn't caused by a maximally heavy thing at all. It's caused by principles like gravity and the weight of things, right? And so mass and these other forces cause heaviness, not what's maximally heavy. And so 5 seems to be clearly just something that is incorrect, And if you apply it at all regarding all sorts of other things, it seems to be wrong-headed as well, Is it right that the maximally good thing causes all goodness in the universe? That doesn't really seem clear either as well. So I think this is, again, a good example where you have one premise that you can press on pretty well, and it kind of, the argument will buckle if you do, So, okay, well, I hope you liked that one. The next example we're going to look at is the fourth example, which is a bit of a different one. It's more contemporary philosophy, and it's by a philosopher called Frank Jackson. Okay? Now, as a setup for this one, what Frank Jackson tries to do is he tries to give us a bit of a story about a woman named Mary. Okay? And of course, the story is just that. It's a work of fiction, right? There's no actual person named Mary, right? And so he just kind of cooks up this story about this fictional person for the sake of making his argument about physicalism. Okay, so keeping that in mind, Jackson says, Mary is confined to a black and white room, is educated through black and white books and through lectures relayed on black and white television. In this way, she learns everything there is to know about the physical nature of the world. She knows all the physical facts about the environment. Physicalism is not the non-controversial thesis that the actual world is largely physical, but the challenging thesis that it is entirely physical. It seems, however, that Mary doesn't know all there is to know, for when she's let out of the black and white room or given a colored television, she will learn what it is like to see something red, say. This is rightly described as learning, and she will not say ho-hum, hence physicalism is false. Okay, so here's a bit of a different passage, and we've got some kind of tricky things going on in it. Obviously, one of the terms that we've got to understand, right? Step one is, are there any terms that are tricky? Obviously, he's using something called physicalism in here, and he's talking about physicalism, and he wants to show that it's false. So physicalism is obviously a term here that we've got to understand this argument. Now, what physicalism is essentially it's a theory about the universe, right? And it's a theory about what exists in the universe. And essentially what it says is that all things that exist in this universe are physical, material substance, right? Matter. Okay? And I think a good way to think about what physicalism says is that everything in the universe is either a material object, or it's something that the scientific laws can apply to, or it's those laws themselves, right? And that's all there is to the universe, right? And so essentially what physicalism says is that science can explain all, right? And so there's no such thing, for example, as any kind of spirit or any kind of ghost or God, right? All those things for a physicalist have to be some kind of physical manifestation, right? Okay. Now, as a follow-up, what Jackson is trying to claim here is that view is false, and that view is false because of what Mary is said to learn, right? So Jackson is talking in this passage about Mary learning of a color red. Now, what Jackson is worried about in particular is Mary learning of the experience of red, what it's like to see red, right? Now, to understand exactly what he's saying is, Jackson isn't worried about Mary learning, like, say, the physical scientific properties of red, like, say, the wavelengths of light, for example, or how light affects the eye, right? Those would be all physical explanations of red. Instead, what the author of this argument is worried about is the way Mary feels, the things that she sees internally, subjectively, when she sees red. You know, it's that experience, that subjective experience of red. And what Jackson thinks is that Mary could learn all physical facts about the universe and yet not know that. And so that can't be physical, right? Which is why physicalism is false, right? Okay, so then, again, our second point here is to find the issue of the passage, right? And again, this is, I think, a good example where if we look back at the passage and find the conclusion of the argument, because it's so clearly indicated in this one, that we know that the issue is just a conclusion phrased as a question, right? So at the very end of this passage, Jackson just says, hence, physicalism is false, right? That's Jackson's conclusion. And so we might phrase the issue then quite simply as, is physicalism false? And then, of course, the answer, Jackson's conclusion, his answer to that one would be yes, it's false. Okay? Now, given we know that his conclusion is that physicalism is false, what about Jackson's premises? And so here we might look to the passage to provide some help, right? The first thing I think that we want to consider is this story about Mary, right? And I think what we want to do is, instead of putting everything about Mary in our argument, we might just want to kind of sum it up, right? So here's what it says. It says, Mary's confined to a black and white room, is educated through black and white books and through lectures relayed on black and white television. In this way, she learns everything there is to know about the physical nature of the world. She knows all the physical facts about the environment. Now, personally, what I like to do here is just pull out kind of like a summary of what that story means. And essentially, I think what Jackson's trying to say is that you have this person named Mary who knows everything about the physical nature of the world. Okay? And so I think that really needs to be our premise here. Mary knows all the physical facts of the universe. Right? Something like this. Okay? Now, the next point in the passage, Jackson, is really trying to tell us what physicalism is. He says, physicalism is not the non-controversial thesis that the actual world is largely physical, but the challenging thesis that it is entirely physical. Now, understand here that we don't want to include in our argument what physicalism is not. We want to include in our argument what physicalism is. So Jackson says physicalism is the challenging thesis that the universe is entirely physical. So we're going to put that into our argument as the next premise. So far then we've got two premises, right? One, Mary knows everything about the physical nature of the world, and two, physicalism is the thesis that the world is entirely physical. Okay? Now, if we continue reading then, Jackson says, it seems, however, that Mary does not know all there is to know, for when she is let out of the black and white room, or given a color television, she will learn what it is like to see something red. Right? So here, I think we can see two premises. One, that Mary doesn't know all there is to know, and two, Mary learns what it's like to see red. So then that is added in, and we get four premises now. One, Mary knows everything about the physical nature of the world. Two, physicalism is the thesis that the world is entirely physical. Three, Mary doesn't know all there is to know. And four, when Mary sees something red, she will learn. Right? But if you think about those four premises there, it looks like the conclusion that physicalism is false will follow from those four. And so we can kind of just add that in and we have our argument, right? So our argument will be structured like this. One, Mary knows everything about the physical nature of the world. Two, physicalism is the thesis that the world is entirely physical. Three, when Mary sees something red, she'll learn. And then four, which is really what follows from three, thus Mary doesn't know all there is to know. So then five, because she doesn't know all there is to know, and yet one, Mary knows everything about the physical nature of the world, it follows that physicalism is false, right? Because there's got to be other things besides physical stuff, right? In the universe. That's what Jackson is trying to claim. So now that we've got the formalization of our argument down, right? We've got four premises and a conclusion. Let's think about how to evaluate the argument. Okay? Now, here there's a number of ways to go. I actually think this is kind of a tough one to challenge. But we might just ask first and foremost about premise one. Premise one is actually kind of a strange one. Premise one says, Mary knows everything about the physical nature of the world. You might just ask yourself, what would Mary have to be like to be knowing all of that, right? And if you think about it, right, Mary would have to be omniscient. She'd have to know all. So essentially, Mary would have to be like some kind of God, right? And if you think about it, really, that's not really possible for any human being. And so you might sort of question the whole idea that Jackson's giving us in this argument about Mary, right? Is Mary even possible, right? Now, the other point I'll make is that another way we might challenge is just to challenge three, right? I like to think about a simple point, right? If one was true, how could three be true? Think about it like that, right? If Mary knew everything about the physical nature of the world, then wouldn't she know red? And the simple point, I think, is really that when you think about what's physical in this universe, right? When you think about participating in the physical universe, being a part of it, to me, it strikes me that subjective experience is at the heart of that, right? It's your interpretation of the physical world. So then, wouldn't it be physical as well, right? So you might just simply argue in response here that if one was true, if Mary knew everything about the physical nature of the world, then three would have to be false. Mary would know already the color red and the experience of it. So, okay, well, I think that's it, guys, for our four examples with evaluating arguments and formalizing them. And I hope you enjoyed that. And we'll see you next time.